Hi, everybody. I'm Lindsey. This is Sarah. I'm sure you know us. So we are, of course, with Mavinhouse Events. We are a modern planning firm. I'm personally based in Portland, Maine. Sarah is down in Newport, Rhode Island area. And we serve, modern couples who have a distinguished vision about their wedding plans and event plans all together throughout New England and the New York region. So you can schedule any sort of chats with us. We're always open to talk about weddings and events. If you want to schedule a complimentary consultation call with us, we are more than happy to chat. You can do that by just messaging us on Instagram. You can schedule openly on our calendar, which you can find on our website, which is just www.mavinhouse.com. And you can just get in touch with us really however you want. We're available throughout the internet. Email us, text us, whatever works for you. So if you have any questions about today's webinar, you can feel free to chat your specific questions into the chat box and we will answer it live for you. But of course, you are here today because we are talking about wedding budgeting. So Sarah and I, this topic kind of came up pretty organically. A little secret, this was not our scheduled webinar topic, but it was something that during one of our team calls, we found ourselves organically talking about budgeting and how top of mind it is as people, are going throughout their plans or starting to get, into engagement season again. Budgets are really just top of mind. So we wanted to kind of pop in, change our trajectories so that we could kind of help people as much as possible as we talk about budgets and defining your budget, managing your budget, and just kind of understanding how you should create your budget as the industry is changing.
Totally. I think that this just felt really relevant and we want to make sure when we do these webinars, we love to make sure that our topics, while everything is super important, like certain things are more prevalent at the different stages of planning. And we just felt like with any, potential new calls we were getting or any of these consultation calls when people would reach out, a lot of the questions were surrounding budgeting. And so we just felt like kind of putting together our normal general thoughts about budgeting, again, and putting that out there, and then also layering in some of the implications of what's been going on the past couple of years and just how the industry and the market is changing a little bit was affecting budget. And we felt like it was important to just kind of address those things and fold that into our budgeting conversations. So I guess maybe what we could start with is kind of like our normal go-to tips for budgeting that we've probably touched on at some point in if you've watched any of our previous webinars, but I think that they're kind of the tried and true, super important. And definitely the number one thing that we always say is make your guest list first. It's definitely can be a really tedious exercise. I know I have couples that it takes them months to pull their guest list together because of, family conversations and traveling and all the things, but it's very important that that guest list is established from the beginning, because ultimately when you're thinking about the budget, you're thinking about price per person, and automatically the larger the guest count you have, the more you're spending per person on not only food and beverage, but also thinking about rentals per person, and even floral, jumping from 15 to 16 tables can often have more of a financial impact than people think about. So really narrowing in that number. Then also who's contributing to the budget. That's another huge factor that a lot of people kind of just want to like skim over. Oh, I haven't had those conversations yet, or we haven't really talked about a number, which obviously in the beginning of planning is totally normal and definitely something that can kind of be difficult to bring up with your family or whoever you might be having contribute. But we do think that having those conversations early, upfront, understanding where your funding will be coming from is very, very important. And then also thinking about if you can get to a bottom line or what number that you feel like you could not possibly go over, you establish what that will be so that you can sort of work backwards and piece together your categories. About those categories, we like to always remind people that they are constantly fluctuating because there are so many different choices that you can make. And ultimately, when you're building out your budget from the start, you may not know what you're going to choose for all your flowers exactly, or you may not know what rental items you're going to be drawn to if you want rental upgrades at all. But starting to kind of get in a range is where we would start, but understanding that you may go over in some and come under in others. And so just kind of approaching the budget with an open mind and understanding that it may change.
Absolutely. I think that we also always talk about like, where are you excited to be spending your money? So there's certain decisions that come along the way of, like having a videographer is very important for some people, and other people, it's one of those categories where maybe it's not that much of a priority and they'd rather spend their money in florals or a very big dance band or something like that. And so just knowing kind of upfront what you're excited about spending your money on can also help to kind of dictate where your budget is going to fall, and what is a more of a priority for you can be very helpful when
Totally.
you're an overall budget.
Yeah, and starting to do research in those categories first, I think makes the most sense. So, we constantly do this with new couples that come to us, like, what are the things that you're excited about? And, how can we make sure that those are the must-haves in your budget, and then give you advice on other areas where you may be able to spend a little bit less. And so really prioritizing. And in that way, I think that it just goes to illustrate how custom budgets really are. And like something that we do for couples is, talk about those things. And then even if they haven't yet booked, sometimes we're employing like a sample budget that helps just like people understand, okay, these are all the things I think I want. How would you spend my bottom line budget, or how would you allocate that money? And exactly like you said, your priorities definitely should dictate that, rather than just kind of average numbers that the internet might be telling you should spend on certain categories. I know for myself, planning my wedding right now, something that Lindsey and I were chatting about offline too, and just kind of going back to that guest list number and thinking about cost per person, it does inform or kind of make you think when you're making your guest list, like, do I want to have 250 people, knowing how much money can be attached to a person? And of course, for some people, that is absolutely what they want. But like for me, I wanted a smaller guest count. So I'll be keeping my, list really small, because priorities for me are just, food and design and all the things. And I want to make sure I can do the things that I want to do and have the wedding look the way I want it to look. And that's all working within budget and understanding how to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's definitely one of the things where if you start getting into conversations with family about inviting, second cousins or parents' coworkers or all these things, that all kind of circles back to these things about like, what are you excited to be spending your money on? Who's contributing financially to the wedding? Like, who even gets to make those decisions about the guest list and things like that, because it all kind of spirals and rolls into where that money is being allocated towards. It's expensive to feed people sometimes, so if you're, excited to be spending your money, again, like we always say, like florals, some people are just really excited to go, really flower heavy. That's very important to them. There's some decisions that can be made along the way to make sure that you do have the budget to be spending on those areas like flowers.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think now that we've kind of talked about those go-tos that we always have and will always recommend, I think, another tip that we discussed is, especially in this current climate, and just when you're starting to understand what things cost and you've thought about your priorities and what areas you're wanting to spend, I think something that we see commonly, or maybe not commonly, but we do see often, I would say, is people that fall in love with a venue and they think like, I just have to have this space, and potentially they can't imagine transforming a space that maybe is a little bit of a lower budget or still has the same feel, but needs, more outside vendors to come in to transform it. And maybe they're overspending a little bit at the beginning and eating up a lot of that budget on venue, which sometimes is the right choice, because that venue may have like a ton of ambiance and you don't need to bring a lot of other stuff in. But we do caution people to making sure that at the beginning of your booking process, that if you've established a budget, that you really try to stick to that budget, because going over in a category in the beginning can have a lot of ripple effect as you move through the rest of the planning process. And then you might find yourself stuck where if you didn't understand exactly what comes with the venue, or you haven't had those conversations, or you're not working with a planner that's gone on those walkthroughs with you to ask those questions, you might find yourself like, oh, I don't really like those chairs, but I don't really have room in my budget to swap them out. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about the implications of spending, especially in those larger categories like venue and catering and, all of the big ones for sure, so that you make room for those smaller details and those adjustments that you might want to make along the way.
Yeah, and I always like to remind people too that, if your venue does include catering and bar, are you looking at what the price will be for you, or are you looking at what the food and beverage minimum is? Because if they have a minimum, but your guest count is going to, put you over the minimum anyways, the minimum that they're advertising is not what we're putting into your budget. It's, something that's based on your guest count, and it's customized for you. So sometimes, the numbers that people can be showing you and the numbers you're gravitating towards and looking at, you've got to be, watching out for that fine print, or everything from, taxes and service charges. A lot of venues just have different service charges, anywhere from no service charge to 15 to 25%. It really fluctuates. And so making sure that you're asking along the way, okay, the venue fee is X amount of dollars. Is there a service charge on top of that? And that can all help you to understand, am I going over budget up front?
Totally. Actually, that's a really good point that you just brought up, and something that we didn't discuss before. But I think that food and beverage minimums, if you're not familiar with what that really means, can kind of be misleading, and not intentionally misleading, but of course, like, you may think that's what I'm going to spend, and it's the minimum, that's all I have to spend. But you really want to make sure, like you said, you understand what type of menu is this, like what bar package is this, like what have I been quoted to get me to that minimum based on the guest count that I've allocated, and should I go over that guest count, how will that change my bill in this scenario? So that conversation, I think, can sometimes get breezed over, and it can be easy to think, if that's the minimum, I'm just going to stick to that. But if you haven't thought about, oh, I have to have, this is my favorite tequila. Oh, I have to have Casamigos, or I have to, have a specialty cocktail. I have to have all of these things. Those get added in, and thus are eating away from other categories in your budget. So just making sure that you really customize those quotes up front and really talk about what you're looking for to make sure that that final number is in fact in line with your budget, and not just the minimum being in line with your budget.
Exactly. And just watching out for those fees, really reading and asking questions. There's never too many questions you can ask when it comes to your budget. You really want to make sure you have a good handle on the information you're receiving and the money that you're spending, because any sort of money spent on a wedding is very personal, and it's very, distinct money. That's like hard-earned money is spent on very personal items when it comes to weddings. So every choice we just want to make sure is very personal, and you're happy and excited to be spending that money, because it's big. So
absolutely. And that goes for no matter what budget you have. I think that, and another note, just it's important, I think, to say, is that venue managers, catering managers, whoever's doing those budgets for you up front, like, they're more than happy to customize those and really like make sure that those initial proposals reflect what you actually want. And I think that's something that we definitely do in our process. If you're filling out our questionnaire on food and beverage and things, when we're gathering initial proposals, we want those to be reflective of not just a generic menu that someone else might have chosen, but one that reflects your preferences, because there may be, like we've said, hidden costs that are associated with those preferences. So that's something you do want to bring thought to when you're getting those initial quotes and gathering that information.
For sure. So should we go into kind of like what we're seeing right now about, of course, we have all of our tried and true, how to approach the budget up front, but what are we seeing now, ending the 2021 season, heading into 2022, about how just managing and controlling budgets is changing really a lot?
Totally, totally. I think that, when we were talking about what we were going to discuss in this webinar, I feel like some of the common things that were just kind of coming up were that obviously, or maybe not obvious, but I think it's obvious that we're heading into sort of this wedding boom where there are more weddings taking place from people that, moved their dates or just held off getting married because of everything that was going on. And now they're feeling like we're in a safer space. And so 2022 is definitely set to be one of the busiest years. We thought this year was busy, but I think next year will be even busier. But there are some implications that we're still seeing from, the postponements and just the current state of the world and how that affects the wedding industry. Although we're in a boom, there's definitely still some things going on behind the scenes that can directly impact pricing. And some of the things that we called out, which we can kind of dive into, in order here, are some supply chain and supply issues in terms of product, in terms of labor. Cost of labor increases. We all know that we're kind of facing a nationwide labor shortage in all areas of the world, and the wedding industry and hospitality world is no different. And then also just regular scheduled price adjustments for people. Often wedding vendors are adjusting around every 2 to 3 years. And so it's hard to believe it's 2020, it has been 2 years. And so some people are, needing to adjust their prices just in normal circumstances, not necessarily to combat anything that they've gone through for the past 2 years, but just because it's time to do so and they're advancing in their career. And then I loved this note that you put in for us too about quality of life adjustments, because I do think that, there's been some implications for folks about just how they want to schedule their business and how they want to adjust, what they take on. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything from, some photographers who used to do a Friday wedding and a Saturday wedding might not want to do that anymore because, they have families now or whatever it may be, like lives change and priorities change. And so I always call that like a quality of life change, which impacts businesses. And just, some people who maybe were just starting out in the first 3 to 5 years of their career would have been taking a lot of work up front. And now that they're a little more established, they're not taking as many projects because they're able to do that, one, with their business, and two, with just the priorities they've established for their own lives, which can impact pricing and it can impact availability with some of the preferred vendors that you may be looking for. So we always kind of want to make sure, for many reasons, like how many projects are vendors taking on a weekend.
Totally. I think that coupled with availability and just the fact that more weddings are happening than ever it can make dates feel a little bit scarcer or feel like things are being priced a little bit higher. So I think it's just all about being strategic, being flexible, and being open in terms of like who you want to book. And I think all of that comes into just researching, right? And just understanding like what is out there. There are so many talented vendors in all of these different categories. And so, side note, but like, don't get discouraged if you reach out to someone who's been on your dream list and maybe they're not available. Like, there are so many people that work at a wide range of price points, and like there will be someone that will be an amazing fit for your wedding and for your plans.
Absolutely. And what I always say too, when I'm talking to clients and they may start to feel discouraged, for instance, like fall 2022 is very busy and the dates are moving very quickly, is that what's great, just like a little moment about Mavinhouse, is that I don't have just the resources of the Maine market. I have the resources all the way from Maine to New York, because we have planners, down the coast. So our Rolodex of preferred vendors is really quite extensive, and we're always working with new people, and we're always, on the hunt for the best fit for our clients, just not only aesthetically, but also, of course, within their budget. So it can all really come into place, and you might be really excited to find somebody new who hasn't been on your radar, and then they become the perfect fit for you.
Totally. I mean, we always kind of joke, it's like you don't have one planner, you have like five, because we're all a larger network and we can lean on each other and we have access to just such an amazing, talented pool of people. So yeah, I mean, I think that it gives you access. And then also if you're in an area where like a lot of your friends have gotten married, it's fun to have vendors that nobody's heard of before and things like that. So that's definitely good to mention as well.
Yeah.
Maybe we could kind of talk a little bit about like some of the shortage stuff and how that's implicating on like floral comes to my mind, just because of the supply chain issues with floral and, getting certain blooms and all of that. And I think that not only does that, come into play when we're thinking about the costs, but also just like, the trust and the creativity factor of like working with a floral designer who will access what they can and still execute your vision and all of that. And will be strategic about not just purchasing something that's super expensive because you feel like you have to have that particular bloom, but they might find an alternative that's local that they can source and that will be the same vision, kind of a thing.
Yeah, well, so I always think about florals, and then I also think that something that's been coming up in terms of supply shortages has also been paper, which people don't often think about. And I think so with paper, what happens is that, maybe sometimes like the thickness isn't available on like the timeline you need, or the dye isn't available. And so things like that. So that all kind of goes back to making sure you're working with vendor partners who understand you and they trust you as much as you trust them. Because if, say, this one shade of green paper isn't available to you, but you're working with a stationery partner that you trust and that they know they're working for your best interests in mind, that they're going to find you a different green or a different shade or whatever it may be, a different, feel of paper, a different finish that maybe you never even thought of before, and it exceeds those expectations. So I think going into these conversations with your vendors, knowing that there might be a supply shortage somewhere, is being ready to be open to conversations about maybe a plan B or a plan C that will more than likely totally blow your plan A away. So
yes. Totally. And I think the way that we can tie that back into budget too is that if you're feeling really steadfast on a particular decision, that might often have budgeting implications. And so trusting your vendors to say, this is an equally amazing option, but it's more cost effective because it's more accessible to us. So having more of those conversations, and again, in the creative process, because a lot of the supply chain issues we're finding are in these creative areas and these more design focused kind of vendors and those relationships, I think just really leaning on your vendors and trusting them that they obviously are not trying to, price gouge you or anything like that. It really is just keeping up with the supply and demand that exists right now. And can assure you they're working overtime to, of course, want to source and use your plan A, but there may be other options that are better for your budget. And you want to make sure that you're open to those and just going into those processes and those conversations with like an open, trusting sort of demeanor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that always with the budgets, it's one of those things we're going back to, you don't want to overspend in a budget too early, because you can't. I always tell clients, if you're overspending in an area too early, we can't just take that money from an area that hasn't been booked yet, because we don't, that money has been allocated for photography or something, and we can't just take that money away and decide we're going to spend less on a photographer when we haven't talked to any photographers yet. So making sure that when you are making these decisions along the way, you're really looking at your overall budget and watching it and making sure that, okay, you know what, I decided I wanted to spend X amount of money on stationery, and I made that decision for a reason, because I know that the quality of vendors I want are going to fall into this budget in my other categories. And then, along the way, for instance, right now, I have a client who, for some, star alignment, almost every single vendor we've chosen has been under our budget. And so what we're doing with all of that money that was over budgeted is we're putting it into our fund budget. And so now, and we're just putting it aside. We're putting it aside, and it's probably going to come out later in some sort of like exciting design choice, or maybe we'll add a saxophone to the band or whatever it may be. But like, there's these opportunities along the way of, oh, okay, like what a surprise. We came in under budget, which does happen. Not everything comes in
Yes.
budget, we promise. And it just kind of keeps everybody excited of like, oh, actually, you know, we're excited. We can go splurge in this moment, or, you know, we haven't booked this vendor yet. So why don't we look at something that is in a next tier of vendor category that we wouldn't have considered earlier because we have that extra money. So it's all about kind of watching those categories, knowing that they could fluctuate in both ways. They could fluctuate up or they could fluctuate down, but making sure that you have control over that along the way.
Totally. And I think just keeping in mind, and the way that we always approach budgets is being on the conservative side. Like, even if you're like, oh, there's really no way I like want to spend this much money in a category, you might surprise yourself also, but it is always fun when you come under budget. So I think that it's good to go into it, not kind of putting the bare minimum that you think you can squeak by in categories, because often that's going to lead to disappointments along the way and feeling like you're going over, rather than just setting your expectations that this seems to be the market average for this category. So whether or not I thought this is how much I would spend, sometimes that little bit of like education and learning as you're doing research helps inform kind of what the going rates are in certain categories.
And I mean, what I always say to my clients too is that when, you know, you have hired us for doing the vendor research and the vendor vetting for you, is that I'm never going to show you a vendor who's initially over budget. What happens is that we'll show you vendors within your budget. And then if you've made the decision, okay, like I'm not really relating to any of these, then it's always your choice to go over budget in that category. It's like, it's something that we don't want to spend your money for you. We want to find the right fit for you. And if that fit ends up being over budget, it's a conversation that happens. It's not something that comes along very cavalierly. It's we totally recognize and understand that, again, all money spent on weddings is very personal.
Absolutely. I think that's such a good point. And if there's room to borrow from other categories, we will. And if not, sometimes it's just a decision that this is so worth it. We want to go over and we want to spend more. So that definitely happens too. Should we go into kind of now just talking about like the information that exists? I know we're kind of talking about like the research phase. And so I think maybe defining what we mean by like researching would be helpful for people. I think that often the first instinct is like, how much should I spend on flowers for my wedding? Or how much should I spend on a photographer in Newport, Rhode Island, or, you know, what have you? And I think due to all the number of things that we just mentioned, the information that exists on those simple Google searches might not necessarily have caught up to where we're at just in the current state of the world. So I think what we're talking about when we say research is really reaching out to vendors and starting to gather some of those quotes and getting some of that pricing information so that you can really see directly from the people that you're interested in working with, what are the costs? How much do you charge? Like, what are those fees that we mentioned? And really starting to get your hands dirty, or start working with a planner that can start sourcing that information for you and helping you to kind of inform what the going rates are.
I mean, at the end of the day, the best information you're going to get is that primary source directly from the vendor information. So, you know, just like Sarah said, everything we've mentioned in this webinar, the resources online, those, you know, blog posts or whatever it may be, have not really been updated to reflect, you know, supply shortages or just general cost of living increases, all of these things. So, you know, we always talk about, you know, okay, you could be researching and somebody says, yeah, you should spend 30% of your budget on your catering or whatever. I feel like that's a number that often like comes up, and I've never understood it. Because maybe that's not true for you. Maybe, you know, like your food and beverage is very important to you and you're spending more than that. Or maybe, you know, you're not having a plated dinner or you're not doing something. So budgets are so customizable, and it's not a one shoe fits all kind of situation. It's very, you know, like it's just different for every single person. So you can't always trust what you're reading online in those situations. which is why we always recommend, reach out to the professionals themselves, contact a planner who has the connections or is talking to other vendors about what their plans for next year are. And oftentimes we do receive notes about, hey, just letting you know, at the end of this year, I will be changing my pricing to this. And we know that, and we can anticipate that. So we're always adjusting how we are crafting budgets, which then has a positive impact for the client.
Totally. And like you said, not all weddings are the same, but also not all markets are the same. So when you're researching, you also, I think it's very misleading to be able to go on and Google how much should I spend, and 30% of my budget should be catering. But that's so different depending on where you are in the country. Like I know the Newport market here is very insular, and it is, it has its own sort of little world here for pricing. And I'm sure Maine is completely different. And Boston is completely different. And of course, there's some overlap, and there's some general, pricing models that sort of follow one another to stay competitive. But I do think that, really understanding the people in your area that you're working with, it can be very different than what you're finding, and can be a little misleading. And it's unfortunate when people rely on information that isn't particular to their space. So I guess moral of the story there is, like, doing your own research and reaching out to people directly is always the best source of getting information, or doing a consultation call with us and talking about budget and saying, like, I'm in this area, I really am feeling overwhelmed about, how to think about my budget. Like, we're here to help with that stuff too. So even if you're unsure about hiring a wedding planner, or wherever you're at in your process, like, those are conversations that we feel strongly about having with people, because we really want to be transparent and giving people the best information so they don't feel ill-equipped to move through their planning.
Absolutely. So I think we're just at about our 30-minute mark here. If anyone would like to chat a question in, we are here and available. If something hasn't kind of come up in this moment that you want to message us about privately, if it's a personal question that's specific towards your budget, like Sarah said, we are always here, and we always want to talk to you to make sure that you feel confident moving forward with your plans. We have our, partnerships are right on our website. We are very transparent about Mavinhouse pricing. Our pricing is directly on our website, so you can figure out right away, if which partnership may be right for your budget, and things like that. And so all of our partnerships do, address budget in some way, whether it's budget creation, budget management, payment reminders, all of those things. We do recognize and appreciate that a big part of wedding planning is controlling and managing the budget.
Absolutely. So yeah, I hope that people do reach out. I hope that this was informative and helpful. I feel like we identified this as a big topic. So I think that there probably are additional questions, and we would encourage people to reach out and, share the recording with your friends that maybe couldn't join us today. But we appreciate everyone's time today. And hopefully you learned something.
Thank you so much. And as a reminder, everyone will get this, a copy of this recording emailed, and we also always upload it a couple days later to our YouTube channel. So we'll be sure to share the links so everybody has access to it.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks, Lindsey.
Thanks, Sarah. Happy Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday.
I'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye.